Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna Wittenberg and K.S. Barton each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 28, in which Johanna and I talk with author Megan Formanek, author of the series Viking Trading Lands. I'm K.S. Barton, author of the Norse family trilogy, in which the daughter of a Viking Jarl and a young Viking warrior are caught in the middle of a deadly blood feud between two brothers. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hello. I'm Johanna Wittenberg. I'm the author of the Norse Women series, which is the story of a real Norse queen who lived and ruled in the early 9th century, which is the dawn of the Viking Age. And our guest, Megan Formanek, is an Australian author with a BA in history, archaeology, and grave goods and unanswered questions drove her to create the Viking Trading Lands series. The books follow Astrid, a 9th century textile merchant who navigates the trade routes of Swedish Viking settlements in the East. Megan's debut novel, Oath Unto Me, was published in August 2022, and her second novel, No One's Vikings, was awarded a red ribbon in the 2023 Wishing Shelf Book Awards. The third book in the series is Serve the Worthy, and it came out in August of 2024. Reflecting Megan's passions for weaving historical detail into fiction, her work explores themes of belonging, tradition, and questioning social norms. So, Megan, tell us about your novels, Viking Trading Lands. I read in your bio that you were inspired by a distaff found in a woman's grave in Russia, and it was possibly inscribed by the deceased's own hands. So that's fascinating.
Yeah. So when I came across the mention of this artifact, I was actually in a super long commute every day to my very boring job in the city in Melbourne. And I spent over 2 hours on multiple trains getting there. So I was reading history books. I had recently graduated university, and I came across a mention of a piece of wood that was discovered from an archaeological dig in what is now known as Staraya Latega in Russia. And like you pointed out, it appears to be inscribed by the woman's own hand. And you're probably aware that that's really rare.
Yes.
We have lots of kind of archaeological finds that say something to the extent of so-and-so owned this item. But the difference with this was that this was a woman, one, and secondly, it shows her contemplating her own fate. Now, I have to say that owing to the, non-specificity of Younger Futhark runes, there's lots of different interpretations of what this inscription is, but the predominant interpretation is, I'll just read here, that it is something along the lines of, the above spindle is rotating. The flashing girl of the reel will have a long and fine thread. Neflorg possesses this distaff. So it shows that she was thinking about her place in the world and her future and her fate. And I think that part was just so interesting to me that Neflorg immediately became a character in my mind. And I had to know what on earth she was doing there, what she was thinking about, and what her life looked like.
That's a really neat inscription. Yeah.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we can say I became a little bit obsessed and spent the next 10 years.
I can imagine.
Yeah, because at school, I think if any of us learn anything about the Viking Age, we learn about to the west. We learn about England, Ireland, the Shetland, the Orkney Islands, and very few of us are taught about the east, like Estonia, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, all of those areas. But it's such a fascinating part, and I didn't learn anything about that in history. So when I saw the mention, I was like, where on earth is Staraya Latega? What was going on there? So yeah, I just went down a rabbit hole, and I'm still kind of burrowing.
Can you tell the listeners where that is? in case, in
Yes.
case they don't know.
So it's my geography has got somewhat better, but I have to say that it's not my strongest point. I have maps usually to refer to. So it's just down the mouth of the Volkhov River, off the Baltic Sea. So if you kind of look at Sweden and you go southeast, and you travel across the Baltic, then it's one of those basins. And I think it's east of St. Petersburg presently.
And it's near the shores of Lake Ladoga.
That's correct, yes.
Very large Russian lake.
From where it has derived its name at times. In the sagas, it's referred to Aldegiborg, and that's what I refer to it in my novels.
Kastaria Ladoga was much, much later.
Yes, that's correct.
When they made a new Ladoga, because Staria Ladoga means old Ladoga.
Exactly. Yes. So there is a historical site there presently, with a fortress, but that dates to much later on. Yeah. So I have been able to see all of that through the internet. So they've been doing a lot of research. Well, they were doing a lot of research there, but due to COVID and the war, a lot of the research has ceased. And the distaff itself was found somewhere I think it was about 1950. So it's currently a historic site. That's
great. We interviewed an author, a nonfiction author, who got to go through a lot of the some of the Russian museums before, and their archives well before COVID. So it's a fascinating, but kind of almost inaccessible at this point.
That is something that I've definitely come up against, that to the English-speaking world, one of the biggest hurdles for this history is the insurmountable, well, not insurmountable, just insurmountable to people who don't have multiple languages under their sleeves, is getting the information and the history about this region. But that is changing. The last 10 years, there's been a lot of development in this area, and people, even the Polish influence as well, like the Piast dynasty coming through there. There's a historian called Leszek Gardella who's doing a lot of work in that area. So I think it's definitely an area of growth that we're going to see a lot more information come through.
When I was researching, one of my characters goes down the river to Constantinople, and I was trying to do a lot of Google Earth maps, dropping it, but it was so built up. There were dams, and I just every time I'd look at it, and and I was just like, this looks nothing like it did in 900. So I just
it's very true.
So I just looked at was it the Russian Chronicle? Wait, it's something.
Yeah, Russian Primary Chronicle. Yeah,
right, Primary Chronicle. I knew there was 3 words, and read accounts, and then I just made some stuff up.
But they're very vague. I mean, you would know, having done that research, they're so vague with their mentions. They're around this area, they portaged for blah blah, and that's it. Or they had 3 portages between the settlement of this, and that's about it. But when I was writing Serve the Worthy, Astrid journeys from Aldegiborg to Kiev. And I spent 2 weeks going through bathymetric studies and plotting I'm very fortunate that my sister actually studies in that area, so she could explain some of the concepts to me. But like you said, rivers change. A lot of the land has changed. So looking at, I guess, the natural rivers as well was really helpful to see where they now have stopped, but otherwise might have flown. But there are areas in Russia that are currently harbors, but were a main arterial river that no longer exist.
Right.
Yeah, there was one fall, and it's been several years since I did this research, and I can't remember what they called it. Something falls, and it was really kind of terrifying, and it's not there anymore because it's been.
It was one of the ones along
after Kiev.
Yeah,
it was in between Kiev and
I think there's 6 or 7 main falls that each have a name, like Isuzi, bubbling pot or something like that.
This one had a really menacing name, and it was a big one. So of course my character's like, what? We have to and they're like, no, we're not going over it, we're going around it. So
I know,
but it's not there anymore because it's been dammed. So it's
because it's very dangerous,
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
And trying to get into the headspace of the characters, having to experience experience that. That's just not something we have to do on the daily. If we want to get from this spot to this spot, we have roads now.
Right. Yeah, I think he even got knocked overboard or something. And anyway, but yeah, it was just fun. It was just fun to just kind of, here's a cool.
They also had
Peachenigs
were
he got
yeah.
attacked by them
when they
too.
portaged. They get attacked by these before the Peachenigs. Anyway, there were several nomadic steppe tribes
that
the Magyars.
Yeah. He got attacked by when he got washed away from his ship, then he got attacked because he was alone and vulnerable.
Yeah, well, they did. They preyed on and then they would take the warriors to the heathen army of Itil in the Khazar lands, and they had this huge group of warriors that they basically placated with money, lots of food, and women, and kept them in a separate area and then marched them out to fight. And sometimes they could earn their freedom, but yeah, if you're in the middle of nowhere and you don't really know where exactly you are and how to get home and you've kind of got a good life, maybe some of them stayed.
Yeah, I'm sure they did.
Because Idle is a long way.
It's so long, yeah.
I had my character go on the Volga because I just didn't want to deal with all the turbulent river Dnieper, which is that's the one with some of those falls are called noisy, and some of them are called don't look back and don't go there. But it's a long trek.
Yeah, but the lure of money, I think, really helps them. It would have to be a lot of money you think you're going to get at the end of the day.
And also the adventurous spirit, of course.
This is true. Yes. I
think my characters were. Oh, I'm sorry. I think mine were doing. They were getting like Arctic furs and taking them down to.
Yeah.
And there was a huge market
stuff, and amber, maybe. I don't remember what all they were taking, but yeah. So is there anything? My next question was going to be about the overlooked aspects of this Eastern trading, right? So I'm sure there's lots more we can talk about that.
I mean, as I kind of alluded to before, I think for the English speaking world, the entirety of the Viking Rus is really overlooked. We don't really learn about them because there's not many resources written in English. We're very fortunate that the Russian Primary Chronicle has been translated into English, but even that has lots of issues with it. It's not contemporaneous, which means it's not written at the time that the events were happening. So we have very few written sources that are happening at the same time as the events. So we have to rely on these kind of incidental reports here and there around it. But something that I think is really overlooked is the fact that there's so much going on in the East, even before the beginning, and I'm using air quotes here, beginning of the Viking Age. So the beginning of the Viking Age being 793 with the attack on Lindisfarne. The dendrochronology dating, which is looking at the tree rings inside to date the wood when it was chopped down to build a settlement, dates Starioladiga to around 750. So that's, almost 50 years before the beginning of the Viking Age. And we also have things like the Salma ship burial in Estonia on the island of Salma near Saaremaa, which is dated to around the same time, perhaps even earlier, which is evidence of Viking activity or Viking Age Scandinavian activity and raiding and perhaps trading on the island there. So all of these things predate the defined Viking Age. So I think that development is overlooked. And I guess in my books, I am trying to focus on the transition between life in what we would call Viking Age Scandinavia, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, so Astrid comes from Sweden, and she makes that transition from a known Viking world that most readers would be comfortable with to a completely unknown, because it is unknown for her as well. She's had very few references, and then all of a sudden she's in this new settlement where there are different rules, mixing of cultures and religions. And I want to show readers that these places were a mishmash. They weren't just like, okay, Viking rulers coming in and then everything is changing. The Viking Rus were very good at adopting and integrating different cultures, religions, gods, food, languages, dress, everything.
Well, I think the Viking Age started with the raid on Lindisfarne is
Mhm.
just so Anglo-centric, right?
It's
It's
so
like
English.
because it happened to England and then it ends in 1026. I mean, yeah,
Uh-huh.
1066
Yep.
because it was in England, right? Well,
Yep.
it just doesn't make it never made any sense to me that
Yep.
they would have like not have known about these people. Like surely
Mhm.
they were trading back and forth before
Absolutely. Yep.
793.
There's a
Yep.
lot of information saying it was way earlier than
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
right. And then if we look at when it ended as well, like Norwegians would probably say that it ends with the Battle of Stiklestad. And in England, it didn't really end because it was a Norman conquest, and who was conquering them? The Normans, who were,
They were Vikings.
exactly right.
exactly. They were Vikings.
Exactly right. So I think the beginning and the end is very loose, but we like a big moment, and we kind of go, okay, we need a box, we need a date, and this is it. And this is what we've got.
And I wonder if that kind, Johanna and I have talked about the Victorians and all
Mm-hmm.
the wreckage they've left with with the Vikings. I wonder if
Yep.
that's part of their legacy as well. Like everything
Mm.
that's about the Viking Age is about what happened in England. So,
Yeah,
and it's
actually,
just been in the last, what, 5 years or so that people have really been starting to look east.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I think there's been a lot of great work done in that area. I mean, I love Kat Jarman's book on River Kings.
Yes.
Oh,
That
me
was one of my
too.
Yeah.
as soon as we got our book that was pretty much dedicated to that entire region, I was like, this is it. It's happening. So it's very exciting. We're more than just a footnote, or if you're really lucky, a chapter in a book.
Well, what I
Yeah,
Yeah.
thought
that's
was interesting is that it seemed like both Baghdad and Burqa also
Mm-hmm.
started up around 750. I mean,
Interesting.
they've done the
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Dendrochronology.
dendrochronological dating for both of those cities as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Burqa was a trading post more than the
Mm-hmm.
city, but also that Baghdad also started up about that time because
Mm-hmm.
it was not an ancient city. It actually was started from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In my books, I have a trader from Baghdad, and he talks about how amazing the city is. And quite frankly, the reports that I saw, like that I read from these traders about the description of the city is now I go, how on earth did they did it? But to a Viking age Scandinavian who comes from a land of wooden houses with no running water, with very muddy, kind of tracks and things like that, it would have just been mind blowing.
Yes.
yeah, that's
Not
what
to
I did.
mention the weather.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I did with my character who ended up in Constantinople. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he's just he's just
Yeah.
constantly awestruck, because
Hmm.
of
Yes.
Hagia Sophia and the
Mm-hmm.
Hippodrome was still there, and just
Mm-hmm.
I can't even imagine somebody like that growing up in say Denmark or someplace in like I don't know up near in like north of Sweden, ending up in a place like Constantinople. I mean, it just boggles my mind because they're not like us. They don't have the internet to be able to look at
Mm-hmm.
pictures of stuff.
Oh
They would
yeah.
have like
Yep.
no idea of what it was like.
Yeah, they
Unless
didn't even have books that
right,
Right.
exactly. And unless they'd met someone who described it to them, that's you can't really even imagine. That's what I guess that's part of the reason why we end up with lions statues looking the way that they do, because they hear a description, they say, okay, you got to make a statue about this or an engraving about that, and it ends up looking as it does.
Well, and then those stories brought back from Constantinople were so exaggerated. What was
Mm-hmm.
it? Harold, was it Harold Hardrada? Was that the
Yeah.
one? Yeah.
yeah.
And he was just doing all kinds of fanciful things. And it's like, really? I don't really think that's true. I think you're exaggerating a bit, but it's fun though, so why
And who
wouldn't
knows
you
how
do that?
much they believed
Yeah,
back then?
Right.
exactly. It's like always when you read something, you're like, there's it's semi-legendary. That's what you have
Yes.
Right.
to remind yourself.
He was a legend in his own mind, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's the same all through the Russian Primary Chronicle. Every character up to a certain point is semi-legendary. It's the things that they did. It's like they might have been a real person, but did they do all these other things
Right.
as well?
Is Olga, was it Olga the Red? Is
Olga
she
of
in
Kiev.
yeah, Olga of Kiev, yeah.
Mm.
No, she wasn't Olga the Red. I'm thinking of somebody else.
But
Anyway, Olga of Kiev. Was she in the Russian primary
she
chronicles?
is. She's one of
Okay.
my favorites.
Don't
I
you
say
love her? I love her too.
she's so good. I say arsonist turned saint. So yes, she's a fascinating character, one that I definitely want to explore in a series that I'm currently working on.
Nice.
I think there's lots of very good Viking age, like Rus princesses around this time.
She was brutal. I mean,
She was.
Absolutely.
And very
Yeah.
ingenious. Some of her
very clever. Yeah.
Very strategic, converting to Christianity, like almost, immediately after as well.
Was there in your studies,
Mm-hmm.
was there a lot of flow of that kind of thing, of ideas about religion and stuff? Did it go back and forth, or did
In
people
my
kind of
university studies?
no, in your studies of
Yes.
the Rus and the people along the eastern trading routes, was there a lot of flow of like religious ideas, or did people?
Yeah, absolutely. In the Russian Primary Chronicle, I mean, the Russian Primary Chronicle is for people who haven't seen it, is an enormous text. It spans hundreds and hundreds of years. So reading it all, which I haven't done, reading it entirely, just reading the relevant parts, is quite a feat. But there are quite a few references to other gods, especially during oath ceremonies. So they talk about Perun, Mokosh, Kors. So Kors is specific to the Drevlians. So they're acknowledging a very important god to them. Mokosh was kind of like the northeastern Slavic tribes, and Perun, I think, was around the Polyanian kind of area, around where Kiev is now. So they're referencing gods that are pivotal to the Slavic tribes. So we know that there's integration. And not only that, but we see in the costume that they adopted, women in, I want to say, the 10th century adopted temple rings and silk headbands, which weren't something that we would see a lot of in Scandinavia until perhaps a little bit later, where they might have adopted it. But it was definitely a Slavic noble dress. So they'd wear these beautiful, bright silk headbands and these ostentatious, jingling temple rings of various sizes. And that's something that they wore, and the men too.
I remember reading about temple rings and trying to figure out what on earth they were.
I know.
And finally, I found a picture of what they probably were, and it's like, oh, okay. But
Yeah.
I was like, little bells or
yeah.
I couldn't figure
and
it
some of them look so big as well. And I think
Yeah.
there are regional type, so depending on which area you're in, but we see them. They're one of the they're a common grave find, or an archaeological find rather.
Well, so tell us about your heritage and what drew you to write about Viking Age women.
So Neflog was the reason that I came to Viking Age women, but my heritage, I've done a DNA test, so I know the facts of the matter, but where I can trace my ancestry back to is not very far. I don't know much for certain. But my DNA tells me I am 40 odd percent Central and Eastern European. So that includes Slavic tribes. But tracing my ancestry, I know that's Hungarian and Romanian. So we're talking Modra there, which would become a power player in the 10th and 11th centuries. And the rest of it is England and Scotland, predominantly the Highlands. And I'm about 6% Germanic. So whether or not I have kind of like a genetic link there, I'm not sure. But I think for me, what draws me to them is, like you've both said, their adventurous spirit. As I look through my ancestry, every single generation that I can trace back to has had an enormous move abroad. And that's not just confined to the women. It's that both genders. We've moved from England to Australia, from Scotland to England, from Germany to England, from Hungary to Australia. So I can't help thinking that it's in our blood to kind of have this wandering spirit, this sense of adventure. So that's really the kind of nexus that I feel with them. I can imagine kind of being in a position where I'm in Sweden and somebody says, your life will be better in Staria Ladiga. Here's your opportunity. And you go, yes, I'm going to take it. It's not, I guess for me, it's not scary to leave my home. I find some comfort in the unknown and learning all about different cultures, religions, food. It's exciting to me. So I can get into that headspace. And once I was there, I really couldn't stop imagining what the next move would be, how the life of the trader would be going from place to place, and how they would develop connections, really close connections with friends who didn't speak their language previously, but in a year or two, you can become very close with.
Interesting. Very interesting. I'm always curious about how people get started on this subject because it's kind of far-fetched from our lives.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe that's part of the allure.
Well, and
Yes.
I think for those of us, not all of us, for some of us who grew up in places like the US or Australia,
Yes.
where unless we're indigenous,
Mhm.
we're all either immigrants or in the United States,
Yep.
slaves.
Mhm.
We're all of us have come from somewhere else.
Right.
Yes.
I think for some of us there is a like an ancestral pull sometimes
Yes.
to want to find out about that heritage. Because I felt the
Yeah.
same thing when I first read the sagas, even though they're just crazy sometimes. Like I just felt this like a coming home kind of
Mhm.
feeling like, oh, these are my people.
Yeah.
Even though what they were doing was like so far removed from my life, here I
Mhm.
was a middle class white girl who lived in the southwestern US, but still I felt that sense of homecoming. Did it feel like that for you when you were researching?
Yeah, I'm not sure like Staria Latiga or anything feels like home, but the adventure feels
Mm.
like home. It's the journey for me that feels right. Yeah, but I think you're so right with Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, that where there's so many immigrants that we feel a pull to our ancestry, and sometimes we can feel disconnected without even knowing that we are. And exploring historical fiction can really give us a gateway to experiencing, whether real or if we're imagining what a life could be like, being able to sympathize with what our ancestors might have experienced is something we cannot get from a historical textbook, because you can read the events, but there's no emotion in it. Being in that narrative, using emotive worlds, having an immersive land, having complex, nuanced characters can give you a very abbreviated experience of what life might have been like.
Especially if you're writing about women, because they were
Mhm.
barely even mentioned in the
Yes.
text. At least, they are now, but they weren't for a very long time, or they were
Yep,
just accessories to the men.
that's true.
So, yeah.
Mhm. Or there some graves have been misgendered, like Burqa
Right.
581. So I think it is changing. We are looking at more focus in women's contribution during the Viking Age, and that's something that I'm really passionate about. I speak a lot about it, and that's one of the reasons why I went into this kind of avenue. At first, I was thinking, should I go back to university and study this? And I thought, I really want to write in a fictional sense. Not that I want to make things up, because a lot of my writing is heavily based in what happened, but we just don't have the sources to tell us exactly what happened. And I really like the idea of being able to show people what life might have been like for a woman, because yes, for the majority of women, staying home, raising children, spinning wool might have been their reality, but there were other options and it did happen.
And I
Well,
think
and
readers
humans
so
learn.
much love to read about that, and
Yeah.
Mhm.
a fictional tale that seems real,
Yeah,
that could
Yeah.
be real.
Yeah.
exactly.
Humans learn through storytelling. I mean, that's how we
Oh, yeah,
create our
yeah.
reality. So, what better way to step into that Viking world than through fiction?
Well, and when you have to fill in the gaps so much, it's got to be
Yeah.
fiction. It's,
Mhm.
Right.
but it could be true, you know.
I love the questions I get asked at my events. Like, did the Vikings have socks? Did they use pillows? Like, people want to know about these tiny little details. Did they brush their teeth? Are they really dirty? And that's part of the reason why I started my YouTube channel, because I just wanted to have this place that people could go and ask questions and get them answered as well. Because as humans, yeah, fine, we can learn about like a huge battle, but really, like, how did that work? What kind of shoes did they wear? How heavy was armor?
Yeah.
That's the things we're really interested in generally.
That's funny. I wouldn't even imagine people would ask, do they wear socks or
Yeah.
use a pillow? Yeah, that's fun. I remember when I like first researching my very first book, and I was like, what kind of like backpacks did they have? Like,
Oh
what
my
would the
gosh, yeah.
knapsack be made out of? So I went and
Hmm.
listened. Yeah, it's just those little details are fun. And those are always the kinds of things that you spend like an hour and a half researching, and then it's
Yeah.
like 2 words in your
Exactly.
in your
But
book.
those are the things that
Yeah.
bridge the centuries, those
Yes.
little details, like, going to the Viking ship museum in Oslo, and there's
Hmm.
a shoe, that somebody really wore. And so, yeah, there's the ship and the sleighs and all these things that are really spectacular. But for me, it was that shoe that got me because, you could
Hmm.
see that a foot had worn
Hmm.
it. And
Hmm.
and it was so personal. So it's like centuries later, I'm looking
Yeah.
at somebody's real shoe that they really wore.
I'm so
Mhm.
with you there. My thing is when I go to Viking Age museums is spindles
Mhm.
and spindle walls because that is the lifeblood of the Viking Age. And I just look at that and I go, wow, that's fascinating. Somebody
And a
touched it, somebody used it.
very personal items.
Yeah,
Mm,
exactly.
yeah. I went to, and I have a terrible memory. When I was in Stockholm, I went to a Viking museum and they had a lot of stuff from the Sami. And
Hmm.
oh my gosh, it was just so beautiful just looking at their textiles. It
Oh
was
my
just
gosh, yeah.
really
They're amazing.
beautiful.
Hmm. That's an area I would love to research, but I'm not writing about it. So it would just be like a pet project.
Yeah. You got to
Yeah.
stick to what you're doing.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Johanna and I have talked about that before. There's like so many things that would be fun to write about, but it's just so much time and
It
effort for the
is.
research. You've just got to kind of pick a lane for a while
Mhm.
and stick with it.
It's so true.
Absolutely.
Well, we've kind of talked about our next question about historical fiction serving as a
Mhm.
bridge.
You have more to add about that, Megan, that we didn't?
Only that I think with our modern sense of comfort, we can't really understand the thought process and also the discomfort that they were used to. And historical fiction has a great way of getting into the brain and being like, yeah, you think so and so should fall in love, but really that's a terrible idea because what has that person got to offer? How would that life be? Are they going to end up dead in a year because this person doesn't have enough wealth, this person's not connected, and you don't have a house? These are real things we need to think about right now. Our idea of love in marriage is the predominant reason to get married. We love someone and we decide to get married. But in the Viking Age, and this isn't just unique to Viking Age Scandinavia, it's in most places, that wasn't the only reason. And so I think sometimes we need to explore that, and that gives us a connection to our ancestors to be like, why did they make that decision? Because for us, we might not understand, why would you leave your home, why would you make this decision, why would you choose this person to marry? But our way of thinking is not their way of thinking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
and
that
that's
reminds me a bit of my family, like my grandparents and
Mm-hmm.
their brothers and sisters who were homesteaders in North Dakota. And that was their lifestyle. They built everything from scratch. They didn't have anything. They certainly didn't have Home Depot or
Yeah,
you know
this is something we
they,
forget. There's no
they had to be
grocery store.
blacksmith. They had a
Mm-hmm.
blacksmith in town,
Mm-hmm.
who made everything. They, had to import a lot of their lumber because there wasn't in North Dakota. They started out in sod shanties. They
Mm-hmm.
just cut sod and built little shelters out of that until they could import the lumber. When I read the sagas, their personalities remind me so much of those people. I mean, they're people I knew, but they're ancestors because they're so
Mm-hmm.
much older than they lived in a different world than I can even imagine.
Exactly.
mhm.
Exactly. But without kind of that link directly or some sort of narrative, we wouldn't really understand what that would have been like.
I even kind of, my characters' daily lives are not nearly as hard as it
No.
would have been.
Oh yeah,
Because
yeah.
if my female character is spinning wool all day long and at the loom all day long, she doesn't have time to go do anything else or meet anybody. I'm just like,
Well, and what
it
about
would be
carpal
really
tunnel? What about, I
right.
mean,
Oh,
these
right.
people must have been crippled at a
Yeah.
pretty young age from all that
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
physical labor, because no matter how strong you are, you can't spin
Hmm.
with a drop spindle day in and day out without long-term injury.
That's why
Well,
my character is a textile merchant. So she has other
yeah.
people doing that. Yeah.
Oftentimes slaves, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
was that. And the one I'm working on now, she has like some of the neighbors help out. Says it's because her father had an injury. So it's basically her, and her brother does a lot of hunting to provide meat and fur and other things. So, but yeah, it'd be a really boring story.
It's true. I mean, when you look at how many hours women would have spent actually weaving and sewing, I conducted a bit of an experiment myself, and I hand sewed my last historical garment, and it took me 52 hours to
Mm,
Wow.
hand sew that dress together, and it's nothing fancy.
mm.
But I mean, I'm sure I do have some experience in sewing, so I'm not the slowest, but I'm certainly not as efficient as they would have been. But
Right.
just that amount of time for one garment, I mean, you'd be like, one is enough. That's okay.
Well, and something we've touched on in some of our other podcasts is that we don't know a lot about the slaves, but
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it was done by slave labor. And
Yep.
because there is no way, like you said, there's no
Mm-hmm.
way, if it was just a husband and a wife and their children, there is
Mm-hmm.
just no way that they could
Yes.
possibly feed and clothe a family without slaves. And just grinding the grain, for heaven's sake.
Yeah,
That's,
it's unfathomable to our modern mind. And I mean,
yeah.
the Viking
Hmm.
Rus were master slavers. In my books, I do talk about the slavers, but they are other to Astrid. She has a moral repugnancy for that kind of thing. But yeah, it's definitely discussed. It's there. Yeah, it was a big thing in the Viking Age. It could not, like you said, things could not have got done without it.
No. And so I guess that's kind of a bridge,
Mm,
you know, that the fact that
Mm.
you have your character have a modern sensibility.
yes.
I'm sure there were people like that. I'm sure there were, but
Mm-hmm.
that's how you can bridge the gap, because it's
Mm-hmm.
so hard for us to imagine slavery as an everyday thing, but
Yeah,
it
and being
was.
okay with it. Yeah,
And now you
exactly.
have a character who is a bridge between
Mm-hmm.
us and that time period.
I think that's a really important point on historical fiction, is that historical fiction kind of only works if the main character or some of the characters have some modern sensibilities, because they would be almost completely unrelatable to a modern audience if they thought exactly like they did back, well, in that time. Although we don't know exactly how they thought, their actions tell us that some things were okay that are definitely not okay now.
Even when you're talking about the 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
that can be the case.
Mm-hmm.
I have some people in my writers group that we have to wrestle with that sometimes, because they're writing
Mm-hmm.
about an earlier time period in the 20th century in our
Mm-hmm.
lifetime. And
Yeah.
yet some of those values and things are just not acceptable anymore. So how do you get around them? How do you deal with them?
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the
And
things I did with my main character, whose name was Astrid, is that when
It's a
she
good
was a
name.
great
young
name.
girl, was captured briefly
Mm-hmm.
by
Yes.
some like outlaws or something. And then they were talking about, oh, she's pretty, she's healthy, she'll make us a lot of money. And
Mm-hmm.
that early experience really kind of marked her. So
Mm-hmm.
she was kind of like, no slaves for me, because
Yeah.
she had this understanding like that could be me, that could have
Mm-hmm.
been me. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's how I kind of like
Yeah, I see. It has to be
bridged
like
it.
a formative experience in my books. In my novella prequel, which was released at the end of last year, which is Of Woven Fates. It's looks at Astrid's first marriage, which was an arranged marriage, and she felt very trapped by that. So, in a similar sense, although it's not slavery, it's slightly different. She definitely feels like she doesn't want to put anyone in the position where they're completely trapped with no option. So I think you have to have that formative experience to explain it, but you also need that I'm not going to have a slave part of it, because I think readers would really be turned off by that.
Hmm.
Yeah, one of my characters, he's a king's son, is kidnapped and he is made into a slave, and he has to fight his way back from slavery and manage to overcome the people who've captured him and enslaved him. But at first, he doesn't have any ability to fight back because they take all his clothes. They don't they don't feed him. They just work him to death. And of course, he's a prince, a Viking prince, but he's pretty strong and tough, but he has never encountered anything like that.
But these things happen. I mean, we've seen in the sagas, we've got Melkorka, an Irish princess. We've got Olaf Tryggvason, his mother was taken. Like all of these experiences, they did happen.
Yep. And so many of them, most of them didn't live to tell about it.
Yeah. Or make it back. Yeah.
Yeah. But there were situations where slaves became free and they were a regular part of society. And so, that's a whole nother concept. You could make your way out of slavery.
I guess it all depends on the situation around you.
Exactly. So what is it about the Viking Age that you think has such an enduring appeal? I think we've talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I think we can't ignore that Vikings are having a moment, at least the last 10 years. And when I thought about this, I thought, I'm going to look up when the Viking television show started, and I was horrified to find that it was 2013, more than 10 years ago. So we've got Vikings television show, we've got Viking Valhalla, we've got Twilight of the Gods and Northmen, the Norsemen, lots of different things. So they're definitely having a moment. But for me, I think it is that although people's first experience with the Viking Age is aggressive, violent men in horned helmets, although that's, an incorrect depiction, the more we learn about them, the more interesting they become. They're not this 2D picture of violent raiders. We have explorers, traders, kings, queens, and magic. And I think that's all the essential elements for a fantastic story. So I just think that they're endlessly fascinating. I haven't met a single person who said, I started reading about the Vikings, got bored, and put it down. They all become obsessed. So there's that. And I think also going back to the bridge with heritage and identity, that there's almost nowhere in the world you can go that isn't touched by Vikings. And I say this as an Australian, and I realize that the Vikings never came to Australia, but
that we know of.
Yes, exactly. But as we've talked about, we're a land of immigrants, from many places that have been touched by the Viking Age expansion. So we still are fascinated because we have some pull. And so many of the people who come to my events will come and say, I did a DNA test and I've got 2%, 5%, 10% Danish, Norwegian ancestry, and I'm just fascinated with them. I want to learn more. So I don't think it really matters where you come from. There is some connection that we feel.
I was surprised at the magnitude of my readership from Australia. It's in line with the UK or sometimes more. So definitely a lot of readers from Australia who are really interested in Viking women.
And maybe it's something about the Viking adventurous spirit, because Australians have kind of oh my gosh, I can't think of the word. People know us as kind of adventurous, fun-loving
reputation.
People. Sorry, yes, reputation for being kind of fun-loving and laid back, although potentially wouldn't extend to the Viking Age. But the adventurous spirit, I think, is really connected.
Well, when you read the sagas, I think that they were kind of laid back because, they were
sometimes until they get angry.
Tell about things,
Yeah.
Well, if you think about the Icelandic sagas, that was basically a colony.
Yes.
So if people are reading that and they're living in the United States or living in Australia or something, and it's like, well, we started out as a colony, so I can relate to these Icelanders.
Well, and also they were leaving Norway supposedly because of Harold Finehair, so they were outlaws.
Right. Yeah, that too.
I mean, not all of them, but many of them were outlaws.
Yes.
Or
So we share maybe a similar like convict, outlaw, heritage, long journey, adventurous spirit.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't
starting
know.
anew
Maybe there is something there.
yeah.
Yeah, fighting against oppression. So I'm just gonna leave or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you go and speak very often? So you like libraries and things like that? And what do you speak about
Um,
when you do these?
sure. I mean, a few times a year, I will speak at venues. The library has invited me a few times now. I've spoken about women's place in the Viking Age, love and marriage in the Viking Age, and food on the Viking Age, food of the Viking trading routes, where I actually got to do a cooking demonstration and feed people. So that was pretty exciting.
Oh, neat.
But the most recent one I did was love and marriage in the Viking Age, and I was invited for Library Lovers Day, and people wanted to know about, I guess, the basics of the how love and marriage work. So, was there a courtship? Was there love? How did negotiations work? How much did it cost to get married? All of those kind of questions, and then we ended with divorce, as you naturally do. But I think the main thing people were really interested in is the human experience of love. Like, did they love in the same way that we do? And in my books, I kind of explore the gambit of varied relationships. So we have an arranged marriage, we have marriage for love, we have marriage of convenience, and we have dynastic marriages, we have relationships that occur in the shadows. And I think that's not that different to what occurs today, depending on where you live in the world. We still have arranged marriages, marriages of convenience, love marriages, all of the range. But people still loved, sometimes not the person they were supposed to love. And as the sagas tell us, after marriage, love can grow. So yeah, people were really interested in what the experience of love is like.
I think there was this misconception for a very long time that people of the Middle Ages like had no feelings.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Life
yes.
was short, life was hard, so they just didn't
They
get
didn't care about
attached.
the babies.
Yeah, and I'm like, and when I first started writing, I was like, that's just bull. Like, I
Yeah,
don't believe that
absolutely.
for a second. Like maybe they were able to maybe move on quicker after something happened, even though, but I've dealt with like miscarriage and stuff like that. And I'm like, that would still
Yep.
hurt. You
Yes.
know, I
Yep.
don't care if maybe the infant mortality rate is 50%. It's still going to hurt to lose your
Yes.
child. And I don't care if it was 1,000 years ago or yesterday.
Because you have those
Yep.
protective feelings.
Yes, there's hormones are involved, you know, it's
Yeah.
so
I think
yeah.
the difference is that we just don't have the writing. We don't have a letter from a mother being like, I'm really still sad about my lost child from 2 years ago.
Right.
And I mean, the fact of the matter is people do have to get on with things, but putting on a face is not the same as not feeling it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a good point. Yeah, or even loving your spouse. Like
Yeah.
one of my trilogy, my female characters' parents, it was an arranged marriage, but they love each other so much. And so but then there's other marriages that they don't love each other.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, like you said, it's just a wide range of emotions. But I always hated that idea that these people didn't get attached to each other.
Yeah, and I think also love looks different in certain relationships, that you can have a love and respect, which is a decision to support the family unit and stay together and back each other. And you can have that passionate love, and that both of those are totally fine, and they're totally fine reasons to be in a marriage, or, whatever the circumstances are. But they're different decisions for different people, what they want and they accept. And I think they still loved in different ways then as well.
I was just thinking about some of the Icelandic sagas where like somebody was killed, and they usually depict the mother, talking to the other brothers. You have to go out and avenge your brother, or, I'm going to disown you, kind of thing. Like that could be a cover. It could be a front for, I am really upset that my son was just murdered by the neighbor, and you need to take care of this for me. I mean, who knows? It could be something like that. I will feel better over the loss of my child if you avenge his death.
Yeah, I think I can't remember where I read this specifically, but that the men of the family almost owed the acting out of revenge to women because they couldn't do it on their own. So if a woman was like, the harder they goaded, the more they wanted this, then they had to do it.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And
So I can't
also,
remember a specific source.
in the early Norwegian laws, which is after Christianity, but still right just barely after, they have a designation of a woman who is called a ring woman. And she will often be the oldest or the last heir in a family. And she is the one who's expected to collect the weregild in the case of a murder. She's not just entitled to it, she's expected to. Well, they don't say anything about what else she's expected to do. But in my book, which is, set, a couple hundred years earlier, I went a step further and said she was expected to take vengeance herself.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I believe that probably was the case. So women could be the head of a household, when they were the oldest child, the last living person in their family, they had those same responsibilities as men, even in the Christian era. It was legal. It was a legal document.
As in she physically did without giving anything away, she physically did the revenging.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes. Took physical action. That's
right.
what I interpreted an earlier version of that to be, not Christian times necessarily.
Of course,
but
the rules are different. Yeah.
Right. But in these laws, she was still responsible for collecting weregild, and she was the person to ask for it, to receive it, and to go to court to get it. Even in the modern, even in the Christian times. So
things would have been so different in an honor-driven society like this.
Yes.
We just don't have the same rules for our society now.
That's right. And so, women weren't supposed to bear arms. They weren't supposed to dress like men. That's in the Grey Goose laws, for example, in Iceland. But that is a Christian era. Before that, it probably was not forbidden, because why would they forbid it if they didn't already do it?
Exactly right. We only have laws when it's already happening. Exactly. Right. Yeah.
That, and the fact that, we've discovered a number of women's graves where they obviously were engaged in combat of some kind. We don't know exactly what, but women with battle injuries, women with weapons. So to me, that leads me to believe that during the Viking times, they did bear arms and they did take vengeance themselves.
I think this is really fascinating. And I say this to myself all the time. I wish I could go back and observe, not live, because I don't think I would survive, but go back with paper. Yeah. With paper and pen, ask some questions, get some hard truths, like what's women's place like? And, what are we allowed to do and things like that. So we can have that appreciation for the difference of thought and values and legal obligations.
Yes. Well, and another thing is, back in Viking times, who was going to stop them?
Oh, absolutely.
That's a good point.
If she could bear weapons and she could fight, who could stop her? Yes, there were laws, but they were upheld with weapons.
So, well, BJ 581, she was wearing pants, wasn't she?
I don't think they didn't find her clothes. They found her they found this scraps of silk, and they found these tiny pieces of mirror as if they were on her jacket. So they think they found the little silver cone,
the conical
on
hat,
a cap with silk attached to it. So they don't actually know what she was wearing as far as clothing, but there were stirrups, and they believe she was sitting on a saddle, and that her feet may well have been in stirrups, because the stirrups were positioned where they would have been for her if she was sitting up, whether on a saddle or a chair. And she would have had her, but it would make sense if you find the stirrups where the feet are, then more than likely she was sitting on a horse, or not on a horse, on a saddle. And if she was probably wearing pants.
I guess I'm thinking of the recreation picture. I think she was wearing pants.
Oh yeah, they did have her wearing her pants were tucked into her boots. Yes,
right.
I remember that very well.
That's what I'm thinking of.
And so that was the other thing in the Grey Goose laws. They said women couldn't wear men's clothing. Okay, so that means maybe at one time they did wear men's clothing.
Well, there was also in Iceland, wasn't there? Men couldn't wear women's clothing. And that's
Yes.
how that
Yes,
one
yes.
woman got a divorce because she
Yep.
made like cut the neck. So it was
Yep.
kind of like a woman's. And I was like, well, did that mean then that men were wearing women's clothes or that everybody, or if it was like a unisex kind of dress that people were wearing?
I think
It's
it's
hard to understand.
yeah, and we also don't know like if it's to uphold societal norms like around Christianity as well, like the male do this, male do that, because there are other laws kind of going against men who won't marry women and women who won't marry men, like
Mhm.
engaging in societal norms.
So you have this great YouTube series in which you discuss many aspects of the Viking Age, especially, historical women. You've recently done this whole series, including Queen Osa and the Oseberg burial. So tell me, how did that come about? I mean, you started telling us a little bit about, readers would ask you these questions, but what inspired you I really enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. Probably a little bit of insanity. Doing a video every single day was a lot of work, but I wanted to show the diversity and female representation in the Viking Age because although, and the Victorians have a lot to answer for in this, women seem to be like relegated to the shadows. But if you look back at it, we have goddesses, powerful queens, sorceresses, merchants, and every woman. I really wanted to show the variety of the female experience because most people who know about the Viking Age will know about like Ragnar Lothbrok and Rollo and maybe Harold Finehair, and maybe they might know about Lagertha and Aslog, but do they know about Aslog's mother? Well, the woman who they think is Aslog's mother, and the Valkyries, and yeah, I just really wanted to get stuck into that and show the variety. And I definitely didn't go through every single woman. There's at least another month or so that I can get through. Not that I'm going to commit to that again, but I am committing to another video every single day in July, and I'm doing Viking Age food. So that will be exciting. But to your question about Queen Ossa, I certainly don't know anywhere near as much as you do, Johanna. And to be frank, it's not so much her as it is the items within her ship that I'm interested in.
Yes.
So I would say that I was aware of the Oseberg ship, but I only became kind of fascinated by it when the museum closed for renovations. Poor timing on my part, but I think it's also because there's a lot of development going on in the research sphere there. They've got, with the Oseberg tapestry, as you would know, it's not complete as we would like it. It's in like 80 different fragments. And they're doing work, I think it's called the TexRec project, where they're doing some like analytical work looking at the way the fibers move and using some AI applications in terms of like trying to remap.
And I thought they were
things.
using LiDAR also, or not. Yeah.
Yeah, they're using lots of different things. I think there's like 6 or 7 different universities around the world that are looking at different aspects. And I've heard Margaret Havgar talk about it quite a few times. And she's doing color mapping for the tapestry. And the thing that fascinates me about the tapestry is that historians think that it depicts a real procession rather than something from mythology. And I am just hoping to all hope that this becomes like our Bayeux tapestry, and it will be our formative thing about Viking Age belief, that it depicts what they did, because we've got what seems to be shaman in horned helmets, and we've got people hanging from trees. We've got all of these really interesting elements, and I really want to know what they all mean. So I do too. Yeah. And then the wagon as well. I've heard, I think it's Luciano Pizzoli is analyzing the art style and the influences. And I heard him speak not that long ago, and his kind of argument is that the engraving isn't actually done by Scandinavians at all, that it looks like it's influenced by I can't remember exactly the group that he was referencing, but the knotwork itself looks like it's done by somebody who's not familiar with knotwork, and that the depictions of certain animals reference different art styles. I think it begins with P. I can't remember. I'm sorry. But I think the development in that area will tell us a lot about Viking Age belief, and I'm super excited.
Yeah. And of course, there is question as to whether that is Queen Osa's
Of course.
burial because of the timing, but honestly, who else could it be?
And the linguistic like similarity as well is
Mhm.
very convincing. But I mean, who is the second woman? I really want to know that too.
Yeah,
So
and for sure.
That'd be a good title for a book, The Second Woman.
Mhm.
exactly. Yeah.
And we don't even know which one might be Osa because for one thing, there's a span of age. So they're saying,
Mhm, mhm.
about 50 years old for the younger
Mhm.
woman, but that could be anywhere from, 40 to 60.
Mhm.
And the same way with the older woman, they say, well, she
Mhm.
could be 80, but she could be 70.
Mhm.
And then, yeah, also they at one time they thought that she had the younger woman belonged to a genetic group from the Black Sea, and then later
Yes.
they said no, that's not true.
Okay. All right.
So I've
Interesting.
read
Yep.
things that have refuted
Yep.
that too. So that they none of this is really certain.
Nothing is. Yeah,
What
exactly.
is certain is the age. Now they say the burial took place in 834 because that's
Mhm.
when the trees were felled that made the
Mhm.
burial chamber. Well, that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that the burial took
No,
place
it
in
doesn't.
834 because they were well known to preserve wood. They'd sink them in ponds and
Mhm.
bogs and preserve wood for a long period of time for
Mhm.
shipbuilding purposes.
Mhm.
Anyway, it's very, very interesting, and I agree. I'm so fascinated by the
Yeah.
tapestry. I just it was ignored for so long, and
I
thank
know.
goodness Sophie Kraft did very detailed drawings, and later a woman named
Mhm.
Mary Storm, and so
Mhm.
we have some depictions of it when it was first, discovered,
Mhm.
because the tapestries have really decayed a lot.
Yeah.
It's been over a century since they were dug up.
And
It
then
was
they have like no
1904.
color. Yeah. It
Yeah.
would be, yeah, really impossible. But I think with the recent discoveries, I think is in Denmark where they found another wagon burial for a woman. I
Oh,
think it could be really exciting. I think that was just last year that archaeologists kind of wrapped up their initial assessment of that area. I did write it down. Give me 1 second. I'll see where that is. Or did I not write it down? Anyway, it was in Denmark. They found another female wagon burial, and if there's any link, I don't know what kind of engraving, but Luciano Pisoli's kind of idea is that wagon is one that would carry the effigies of the gods rather than anything funerary. And I think that's really
mhm.
interesting. Yeah, I just really want to see where it will take us.
It's so interesting. Well, and also fairly recently they've come across, or they've come up with the idea that there's a lot of Roman influence in Scandinavia,
Oh,
so
interesting.
that there was contact of some sort.
Mm.
Not,
Contact, but not conquest.
obviously not, but
Yeah.
because it's pretty well understood that the trade routes through the British Isles and France were pretty well traveled by the Scandinavians. And so they even some of their battle tactics are often, truly based on Roman ideas, some of their weaponry. And so, there was some kind of contact. Maybe they were
I think,
mercenaries. Maybe they were Scandinavian mercenaries, just like the Varangian Guard,
I mean, they have a history of it, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
And then I think going back to your question about overlooked parts of the Viking Rus, is that we have them pop up in 839 in the court of Louis the Pious.
Yes.
And that's noticed in the Annals of St. Bertin, and they're noted as being part of the kind of emissary from Constantinople. And my argument would be that doesn't happen overnight. You're existing in this area, building relationships, forming alliances, and developing your power well before that.
It's just not written down, at least
Exactly
not
right.
anything we've
Exactly
discovered.
Right. Yeah, but coupling that with like the Estonia burials, the dendrochronology at Aldeigjuborg, we can kind of paint this picture, and archaeological finds, we paint this picture that they were around like in this at least the 750s, even though the Russian Primary Chronicle says to us they were invited in the early 9th century to rule. That's a very convenient story.
Yeah. Yeah, very fictitious.
Yes.
Can you give the listeners your YouTube channel name?
Oh,
or
yeah. So it's just my name, Megan Megan Formanek, and that's most of my handles. Or sometimes you'll find me at Megan Formanek author on, I think it's Instagram. But you can view it on Instagram and YouTube. I post currently 3 times a week, but into July it will be every single day. And this month I'm launching my first long form video. So I'm starting off with looking at why we should rethink the dates that bookend the Viking Age,
Nice.
a personal pet project of mine, and then some of the basics of the Viking Rus.
I like what you do on Instagram. It's all your reels about things. It's very fun. So listeners should follow you.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. If they want to learn about the Viking Age, that's one really great place.
Video is not my thing. So
it's a lot of work, but I do get to dress up in all of the costumes that I make. And sometimes you can see whether or not my years in acting school actually paid off.
Well, I think it does, and how comfortable you are when you're doing it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Was there anything else that we didn't cover that you really wanted to talk about? We have covered a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, really broad. No, I think pretty much everything I had notes on. Yeah.
Oh, great.
I'm looking forward to your new YouTube. It's a new YouTube video. I'm looking forward to that very much.
This month we're going through all of the kind of short digestible bits on the Viking Age, and their legendary kind of dispute with the Drevlians, which did end with Olga. You know, I won't spoil it, but it's a fiery.
It was a great story.
It's a fabulous story.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. It was great.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, K.S., at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.